crowd. He and often night Harman, is everything okay? I can go live? No? Okay. Are you all settled? For those of us who spend our days and often nights thinking about corporate governance, Professor Alex Edmans of the London Business School needs no introduction. He is a leading authority in corporate governance reforms and executive compensation reforms, and is routinely called upon by the UK House of Commons to provide testimony and evidence on such matters. In recent times, many of us have followed with rapt attention his debate with Professor Lucien Bebchuk on stakeholder capitalism. On this topic, his book, Growing the Pie, How Great Business Delivers Both Profit and Purpose, has been awarded the Best Business Book of the Year 2020. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great privilege to welcome Professor Alex Edmans to deliver the keynote address. Alex, the floor is all yours.
Well, thanks so much, Swarnadeep. It's great to be here, and it's the honour to address you all on a topic which is not just something of research interest to me, but also something that I practically care about. I have been asking the people to allow me to share my screen, but nobody's responded, so I'm afraid I can't do anything unless they let me share my screen. So what I hope to speak about today is ESG, and the subtitle is Do We Need It? Does it work? And how to do it? And this is a strange place to start, because you might think, well, don't we all realize that we need ESG, right? It's the order of the day. We're all here because we understand the importance of corporate governance. But in fact, what I'd like to stress is actually it's not immediately obvious that we do even need ESG to begin with. Why don't we just go with the old model of Milton Friedman? So I think a good place to start is, well, do we need ESG? Well, why can't we just go to what Friedman argued in 1970? So what he claimed was the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits, right? A business should just focus on profits. So there's no need for ESG, it's a distraction. And we need to read further than just the title. What he also says is that when we focus on profits, we need to make sure we focus totally on making money and forgetting about any concerns for employees, customers, or society. So that's the baseline. Just focus on profits, forget about all of those. But in fact, that's not actually what Friedman said. This quote here is not from Friedman. This is from a Forbes article by Steve Denning, where he claims this is what Friedman says. And lots of people around the world claim that Friedman says focus entirely on profits and forget about anybody else. If you look at Paul Polman, who's trying to sell his new book, he claims that Friedman argues that we should exploit everybody. But that's extremely unfair, because Friedman never said that. So let's actually try to read Friedman. Like most people who comment on him have never read beyond the title. The title seems to be so stark that it makes his stance clear. But actually, what he's saying is much more nuanced than what we actually think. So to show this, Friedman argued the following. It may well be in the long-run interest of corporation to devote resources to providing amenities to that community or to improving its government. That may make it easier to attract desirable employees or reduce the wage bill. So here, he argues that companies should actually care about ESG issues. Why he said it's fine to focus on profits is that in order to focus on profits, you need to care about society, you need to invest in your communities. Otherwise, you won't have a pool of workers and a pool of customers. Now, some people will say, yeah, Friedman said that, but he did say just try to do as much as possible without crossing the law. So let's do as much that we can get away with without being fined. But Friedman didn't say that at all. He also said, conform to the basic rules of society, both those embedded in law and those embodied in ethical custom. And he said, do not engage in deception or fraud. So contrary to what a lot of people claim, the idea of Friedman, which is to maximize profits entirely, is not about deception, it's not about cheating, it's not about exploiting others. It's about let's go for long-term profits because as long as we define profits as long-term, that will force us to care about these ESG issues. Now, what do people claim a world with ESG is? Well, the Business Roundtable statement said we will deliver value to our customers, invest in our employees, deal ethically with our suppliers. But that is all consistent with Friedman. Right? Friedman argued we would do all of these things because it becomes profitable. Larry Fink, who is now trying to make a name for himself in ESG, writes a letter to CEOs each year claiming things like the more your company can show its purpose, the better able you will be to deliver long-term profits. But that's what Friedman was about. Right? It was about, yeah, let's just focus on long-term profits. And we know that to focus on long-term profits, we need to deliver value to customers, employees, and communities. And so that's something that it should be fine to do. Okay, so why then do I think that ESG is something that is still needed, even though Friedman is much more nuanced and much more open-minded than we typically think? It's because Friedman makes three important assumptions in his paper, and those assumptions are not borne out in the real world. Now, the tricky thing is that his assumptions, he never makes really explicit. You actually have to delve into the article to see what these hidden assumptions are. And so about a year ago, I wrote this article in Chicago Booth's Pro Market called What Stakeholder Capitalism Can Learn from Milton Friedman. It was to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Friedman, to see what his legacy was. And what I argued is that we shouldn't view Friedman as a doctrine, but as a theorem. So what's the difference? Well, in our MBA classes, we teach the Modigliani-Miller theorem, which is under certain circumstances, like no taxes, like no transactions costs, capital structure is irrelevant. Now, why do we teach that? Because clearly those assumptions are not true in the real world. We have taxes. It's to say that the only reason why we might have capital structure being relevant is if those assumptions are violated. For example, if we do have taxes or we do have transactions costs, we can't make arguments like debt is cheaper than equity. And similarly, viewing Friedman as a theorem means that if we are to argue for an ESG approach to the world, it has to be based on some of his assumptions being violated. If those assumptions are not violated, then actually it's fine to focus on profit. And so what are the three critical assumptions that he makes, which are somewhat hidden? So the first is that serving society is a zero-sum game. So there is one example that Friedman gives of serving society, which is charitable donations. Now that is zero-sum because any euro that a company invests, gives to charity, is a euro they can't pay me as a shareholder, and that prevents me from donating to the charity myself. And the important thing is different investors might have different preferences. So let's say Swanedeep and I are both investors of ABN AMRO, and I care about cancer research and Swanedeep cares about animal rights. Well, then ABN AMRO should not be donating its profits to a charity, because if it donated it to cancer research, I would be happy, but Swanedeep would not. Instead, what they should do is pay high dividends to both of us, and we can choose to support whatever causes we'd like to support. However, there are cases in which serving society is not zero-sum, where if a company invests €1, it generates far more than €1 of profit. For example, if we were to take a manufacturer and they invest in reducing plastic packaging, that is far more effective than them paying out the money they would have invested and then allowing us to donate to an environmental charity. So why I think this is a really useful theorem is, yes, companies should serve society, companies should do ESG, but only in cases in which they think they have a comparative advantage. For something like giving to charity, which is zero-sum, actually, Friedman is right. And what we saw recently, right, is many important issues. Let's say there were things like Extinction Rebellion or Black Lives Matter. And the response of a company is, oh, let's just donate loads of money to an environmental charity or Black Lives Matter. And I'm clearly someone who cares a lot about diversity, but is that the best response? If you don't have a comparative advantage, maybe you should not actually deal with it. So that's one assumption. The second critical assumption is that Friedman assumes that government intervention is effective. So why he said that companies should only focus about making profits is that he recognizes that a society has objectives other than profits, but that should be dealt with by governments, right? Because governments are elected by the people and they will reflect the people's interest. For example, there are many people who there's many investors right now who claim we should shut down all coal-fired power stations. However, who are those investors? They are the 1%. They are the rich people who have money that they can invest with BlackRock. If you were to shut down all coal-fired power stations, you're going to make a lot of people lose their jobs. And these are typically blue-collar people who are not represented in the financial system. So the good thing about the government is that the government is democratically elected, where everybody has one vote. And so if the government allows it, then we might argue that it is actually legal and moral, and therefore there's no reason to avoid doing a legal issue. By the same token, it's fine for a company to make cigarettes, because if cigarettes were something that society as a whole does not agree with, then we would have a government who bans cigarettes. So again, I think that's a useful starting point, but where it fails is for two reasons. Number one, it might be we don't have an effective government due to lobbying. Maybe that's the case for the tobacco industry. And number two, it might be that certain things are difficult to regulate. So you can regulate things like minimum wages, but you can't regulate working conditions. And therefore, because that's something which you can't verify, you can't measure it, and therefore you can't prosecute somebody in a court for it. And so that's why a company might actually want to go over and above in providing the working conditions for its employees, because that's something where everybody in the world could believe it's important and the government just doesn't regulate it because it's not something you can prosecute. But again, I think Friedman provides a useful starting point, because if a company is going to do ESG, it needs to first argue, why is regulation not effective? So some of you will know one of the big areas I work on is CEO pay, and I'm sure many of you in the room also do that. And there are some people who say, well, high CEO pay, we shouldn't pay CEOs a lot because it's unfair, it leads to inequality. Even if the CEO has created a lot of value, we should not pay her a lot because that's going to lead to inequality. But inequality is something that the government can regulate. The government can set income taxes. So I don't believe that a company has a responsibility to cut pay to address inequality. Yes, they should cut pay if the CEO doesn't deserve it. They should cut pay if it demotivates employees, but they shouldn't from any social concern, because that could be addressed by the government. The third thing I'm going to look at, and this is the most thing that I'm going to focus on during today's talk, is that Friedman argues that shareholder value can be maximized instrumentally. Well, what do I mean by that? And let me not share the screen, I don't need you to do so for this part. All right? So what do we teach in our classes? We teach net present value. So when a company thinks, do I build a factory? They will think, well, let me calculate how many toys will that factory produce, how much I can sell those toys for, and then what is my profit? That is net present value. We teach this to all our students. And we know that in the real world, there is risk, but we know how to deal with risk. We can do things like sensitivity analyses. Let's change the price of the toys. Let's change the volume of toys. However, what we can't deal with is uncertainty, often known as Knightian uncertainty. What if we don't even have a baseline about which to do a sensitivity analysis? So let's say we're going to choose to invest in people by giving our employees more parental leave. Now, going back to Friedman, how much more money will we make if our employees are happier because of the parental leave? How much more profits will this lead to? Well, there's absolutely no way of doing this, of doing that calculation. And so if we reduce everything to a financial calculation, then a lot of those investments might not be undertaken. And let's think about our job as finance professors, right? We do a lot of great work, which is never really seen. Right, refereeing is something I'm really lucky to see the other side of, but the referees that has served the journal, they put in huge amounts of time and effort. And many of them, right, they might never submit to the journal, so they don't get anything out of it directly, but they're doing it because they just think it's the right thing to do. And maybe unexpectedly, a few years ago, the Review of Finance launched the Best Referee Awards, and then we did recognize some of them. But that was never their intention. They just wanted to do a good refereeing job because it was the right thing to do. And the same with us teaching our students, right? In most schools, teaching does not affect tenure. So if we were Friedman, we would say, well, let's just teach as badly as possible without falling below student complaints. But it might be that we teach some students, then in the future, they start companies and they will be willing to give a guest lecture in our class, or they may ask us to work with them. And that's the whole idea of the intrinsic approach, is that with Friedman, only do something if you can calculate quite roughly the benefits of doing that. But under uncertainty, this isn't going to work. What we're going to try and do is to do things for intrinsic reasons. Okay, so those are the reasons for why we want to do ESG. But notice that even though these three assumptions are not satisfied in many cases, they are in some cases. And in those cases, I think we should still stick with long-term profit maximization. Okay, so that's the first part of my talk, which is why do we even need ESG to begin with? I'm going to go to what is ESG, then does it work, and then how to do it. And I want to allow time at the end for questions. So I'm really sorry that I'm unable to travel, but I would like to have still a long time for interaction. I'd love to hear what your views are. So what is indeed ESG? Now I'm going to have a quite different view of what ESG means to what people typically hear. And to do this, let me move away from my slides and my bullet points to just tell you a little story. So, in March 2020, the UK government had what was known as the ventilator challenge. So the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, he challenged vacuum cleaner manufacturers and other companies to move from making vacuum cleaners to making ventilators to help people suffering from coronavirus. Now that sounds a great thing, but the problem is that ventilators require specialized staff in order to operate them. And because the UK had underinvested in its health service, there were not enough qualified staff to go around. However, there were some people at UCL, University College London, who remembered a technique called continuous positive airway pressure that they used to do back in the 1990s. And they used to do this on a very simple machine called the Whisper Flow, which did not require specialized staff. So they thought, if we could only bring the Whisper Flow back from 1990 to 2020, we might be able to mass produce it and operate it. But the big problem here is the Whisper Flow was such an old machine. Right? Nobody used it anymore. Nobody knew how to use it. This didn't even exist. And indeed, the UCL consultants had to go to the museum at UCL to find a Whisper Flow. Can you spot it? Here it is, sitting in the museum amongst all the other old artifacts. So what they did is they got the Whisper Flow and they thought, well, let's try to reverse engineer it. And they used the might of their healthcare engineering, the mechanical engineering, and their hospitals. But that alone was not enough. What they did was they worked with a company. And that company was Mercedes. specifically Mercedes high-performance powertrains. And that is the division of Mercedes that makes Formula One engines for people like Lewis Hamilton. And they called it Mercedes. Mercedes immediately drove down with their computer-aided design equipment, and the team got together to see, can we reverse engineer this whisper flow and also have a design which is easy to mass produce at scale, because the pandemic is such a bad thing, we need to be able to work fast. Within 100 hours, they had reverse engineered the whisper flow. They got a design that they could mass produce at scale, and then Mercedes started to make 1,000 whisper flows a day in their Northampton factory. And this saved the lives of many, many people. And then after doing this, after coming up with this life-saving machine, what did it do? How did it patent it? How much did it charge? Nothing. What it did is it gave away the blueprints for how to make the whisper flow for free to 1,300 teams in 25 countries around the world. So this was really powerful. This was something which was huge in terms of the pandemic. But what does this have to do with ESG? Let me ask you two questions. The first is, what would have been the impact on Mercedes' ESG scores and reputation had it decided not to be involved in this device, which was called UCL Ventura? And the second, it's only one question, sorry. What would have been the impact? How would have this impacted them had they not done it? The answer is zero. Right? Had Mercedes not bothered to manufacture this device, there would have been no customer boycott, there would have been no ESG downgrade, there would have been no harm to its reputation. Why? Because nobody would have expected Mercedes to even do something as crazy as reverse engineering something which was a museum artifact. And so this is why my view of ESG is somewhat different to what most people think about. We often think that ESG is about do no harm. Don't pollute the environment, don't cheat on taxes, don't mistreat your workers. And many of the data sources that we use in academic research, like ESG issues from the KLD events database, they look at things such as how much harm do you actually do? Let's make sure we don't do harm. We often view ESG as good risk management. But what I want to do is I want to shift our thinking and to think about ESG as being more about actively doing good. How much value can you positively create, even if there was no social obligation to do that, because nobody had expected you to do that to begin with? And so why do I think we should think much more about actively doing good? I think there's first the moral case and the ethical case, which is, given the scale of the challenges the world faces, coronavirus, biodiversity, climate change, it's not enough to do no harm. We need to actively do good. And the second, to our audience of finance professors, is the business and financial case for doing it. And this might be in just terms of future research. As we know, standard measures of ESG, the link to financial performance is pretty unclear and it's pretty mixed. But if to change our minds and to think about ESG as actively creating value, maybe this is something which in future research we might be more successful at linking to company performance. And so that is linked to the framework that's in the book that Swanedeep kindly referred to. So we often think that the value that a company creates is given by a pie. And we can share that pie either with investors in the form of profits, that's the blue, or society in the form of wages and taxes and fair prices. And often we think that ESG is about splitting the pie fairly, paying higher wages to workers, paying fairer taxes, having lower prices, and all those things go into the standard ESG ratings that we are using. But in fact, right, the problem with viewing ESG as just splitting the pie more fairly is it's not about active value creation. Right? What I view ESG as is that it's about growing the pie. Like we want to actively create value for society. And so we do want to increase the orange, but the way we increase the orange is not by giving a greater slice of what's already there, but actively creating value, innovating, being relentlessly committed to excellence, coming up with some crazy ideas like reverse engineering this museum artifact. And the beauty of that is that if we do this by actively innovating, then maybe ultimately investors might be able to benefit. Maybe Mercedes' reputation is greatly enhanced by what it's done. Maybe the employees are much more engaged given what they worked on, and ultimately profits will go up. And that's what we care about as a finance profession. Like often we think, let's give from investors to society. But as you all know, investors are an important part of society. They include pension funds, university endowments, insurance companies. So this is why this different approach to business, to actively do good, to actively create value, is something which is going to be really important. And that is what I think true ESG is about, not just avoiding scandals, but creating value. Now, the third part of my talk is, does ESG actually work? And I don't need to say this to probably this audience, but what's really critical is to highlight the importance of using rigorous research. So I'm sure some of you might have also been frustrated that papers that get covered in the media are ones maybe from some consultancies which are not that rigorous, but because people like the findings, they will get widely shared and liked. So in fact, the evidence for ESG is much more nuanced than what people believe. And I think one of the reasons for this is they view ESG not about pie growing, actively creating value, but more about equality and fairness. And let's just go through one study here, which is on diversity. And again, this is something I strongly care about. Well, I'm an ethnic minority myself. When I took over the Review of Finance, I appointed the first female editors we had in our 21-year history. Massive embarrassment. It took 21 years before we had female editors. This is something I really care about. My comment here is just a question about the evidence and how evidence can be misportrayed when there is an issue like diversity, like ESG, where people have strong opinions. So we have the Financial Reporting Council, which is the main body in the UK in terms of a regulator. This is like the Securities and Exchange Commission of the US. They recently released a study claiming that higher levels of gender diversity of FTSE 350 boards are positively linked to future financial performance as measured by EBITDA margin. I picked up the report. I looked at the tables with EBITDA margin. They ran 90 regressions. Why 90? 6 measures of diversity, 5 future years of future performance, 3 groups of companies, 5 times 6 times 3, that's 90. 0 was significant. Not a single result was significant, yet they claimed to have found this positive relationship, right? And then they also wrote this. These results suggest that gender diverse boards are more effective than those without women. They put this in bold in the study, and they had 180 regressions for this, of which 7 were positively significant and 2 were negatively significant. And one of their main results, the only 7 positively significant ones, were results on total shareholder returns, where they ignored dividends. Yet this was a study that was widely covered by the media, and they just took for granted the claimed findings here without actually looking at the data. Now, this study was actually not conducted by FRC, the Financial Reporting Council. They commissioned it, and embarrassingly, they commissioned London Business School, my employer, to do the study. And so here, people were claiming, the actual people at LBS wrote in the foreword, the Leadership Institute at London Business School treated this opportunity accordingly with the rigor and care of our best scholarly research. The Dean of London Business School had a foreword at the start saying the academic research with which data was collected and analysed yields new insights on the impact of diversity. We all stand to learn from the methodology and findings. So based on the fact that it was London Business School and based on the claims that we have been really rigorous, people just believe this result. And I'm not saying this to get back about my employer. My employer, I've worked with them for 8 years, but this is just to say that I want to apply the same standards of rigor to my own institution as I would do to anything. I'm not bashing another institution here, even when my own institution is to be misrepresenting the data. That is something really serious. And I think this is something which has really plagued ESG research because the evidence is much more nuanced than it might think. So you might think, well, then why do I even support ESG when you do have some studies like this? It's because there is some evidence the other way. And so this was something that I looked at myself 15 years ago when I was doing my PhD at MIT. And importantly, that was before ESG was really a big thing. So there was not so much pressure to get it published. Right now, everybody wants to rush to find significant results on ESG because if you are McKinsey, you can get some great public relations. Back then, this is not a bandwagon. There was not so much pressure to find significant results, but I wanted to look at this because I thought it was an interesting question. So the question is does ES pay off? Well, we know a lot of the research on the G. I don't need to repeat to you composition, metric, and so on. Now, the question is, how do we measure ES? Like one thing you might look at is a company's purpose statement, but we know that companies might not put it into practice. Another approach is to look at things like the expenditure. Are you putting your money where your mouth is? Do you give to charity? Do you pay your workers a lot? How much do you invest in environmental reduction initiatives? But as we know, those aren't great measures because they could just measure how much you're spending, not the effectiveness of your spend. Right? It could be like some football teams spend a lot on their players, they don't actually deliver the results. And on the flip side, maybe some of the best things that companies do to serve society don't actually cost them a lot. What did it cost for Mercedes to invent and reverse engineer those whisper flows? Nothing really. They already had the engineers. It was just a mindset of thinking, how can we use this to help others? And similarly, if you think about employees, some of the best things that you can do is improve corporate culture, be respectful to your employees, giving them meaningful work and skills development. Those things don't cost a lot. So this is why I looked at the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America. Right, so that was a measure of actively doing good, growing the pie. I didn't look at workplace injuries or sexual harassment lawsuits and those things. I looked at which of the companies that are really investing in their employees and trying to prioritize things like pride and camaraderie and credibility and respect for the individual. Now, I had to do loads of things to try to rule out the fact that it's firm characteristics or industries or risk factors. You all know this is academics. This is a bit of an easier slide for me than my typical practitioner audience. Let me just get to the results, right? After all of the controls and all of that stuff, what I found was it outperformed their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period, which is 89 to 184% cumulative. And that's important because my idea of growing the pie might seem too good to be true. Is it the case that if you create value for stakeholders, magically some shareholders will benefit? Well, here, at least in the terms of employee well-being, this is something where you do have the evidence. Now, as we know as academics, causality is going to be a big issue here. I don't have random shocks to employee satisfaction. One concern here might be omitted variables. Maybe you have great management, and great management both improves employee satisfaction, and great management also improves financial performance. So one of the things here is I looked at analysts' expectations and future quarterly earnings. So as we know, we release earnings every 3 months in the US. Before you do that, you have the likes of Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley predicting what the earnings are. And these analysts talk to management all the time, so they will factor management quality in to their forecasts. But what I found was that these best companies were systematically doing better than what analysts predicted. And what's really interesting is that others have just recently replicated this paper. And what they found was that the original results still held, even after throwing in a lot of new models. So now there's 6-factor models and there's Q4, 5 and so on. There's a new factor models, which I didn't know at the time of my original study. That's still robust. And really interestingly, it continues to hold until 2020. Right, so even after the paper was published, and therefore the results should have gone away, they still stay strong. And so why is this interesting? I think it goes back to us as academic researchers. If we want to look at ESG, it is these measures of actively doing good rather than just doing no harm. These more qualitative dimensions, which might be more likely to link to performance, because even though there's loads of ESG investors out there who are probably mining the data and pricing in many things, they typically focus on tangible measures, maybe pay ratios or worker turnover. Something more qualitative like employee satisfaction, that's something that might not be priced in. Now, there's other research that you'll know on materiality. I've got some sort of practitioner stuff here, but I want to make sure I've got at least 15 minutes for questions. Let me skip all this and instead get to ESG investing in practice. What I'm going to do here is put my practitioner hat on. I've served on a responsible investment committee for 6 years. Why? Because perhaps some of the insights of how things are done in practice might give some research ideas to those of you who want to do ESG research. So this is an area where sometimes actually what we do in academia can be informed by practice. Sometimes it's the other way around. Okay. So typically, what historically happened in terms of ESG was that investors would implement it with divestment or exclusion. Well, you define a set of criteria, like say Sin Stocks in the famous Hong and Catchmanship paper. If you did not satisfy those criteria, you were immediately out. And then you had your investable universe, and then you chose from that investable universe based on purely financial factors. So ESG was only a foot in the door. Once your foot was in the door, then people ignored it. But there's many problems with this. So one problem is that one main reason why people do it is they say, well, it's to deprive firms of capital. If we divest from energy, that will stop them having capital. But as we know, that doesn't make sense, right? You can only sell if somebody else buys. And the more nuanced argument is that if you sell, then you're pushing down the stock price and you're going to make it hard for them to raise capital in the future. But energy companies are flush with cash. They don't need to raise capital. So that's not actually something which is effective. Now, a final argument that's made, is that, well, this is to change companies' behavior. This is to punish a bad company in order to try to make it good. But in fact, that's not going to work with divestment. But if you divest from every fossil fuel company, then even if they are transitioning and they have a clear decarbonization plan, they're still not going to be invested in. So the only way that you can change behavior through divestment is if it's conditional, if you're willing to hold the company if it is best in class. And in fact, that's what I studied in my job market paper on block holders and market efficiency, is if you want to change behavior, you shouldn't say, we're going to sell every energy company. We will only sell the energy companies that are not transitioning. That is conditional. That means that if you are best in class, you will be held. If every energy company gets sold, there's no point in you trying to improve because you're going to be getting sold anyway. So this is something which is more out of favour. What we at Royal London have done for the last 15 years is to try to do a more integrated approach here, which is to incorporate ESG factors alongside financial factors. So why do you want to do that? So what does this involve? It involves treating ESG on the same level as a financial factor. When we choose which stocks to hold, we look at their profits and their dividends, but also their corporate culture and the like. And how do we assess it? It's really difficult. We don't look much at ESG ratings or data. Instead, what we do is a net benefit test. We ask, does the company provide a net benefit to society? So looking across all of the things they do, the bads and the goods, and not just the things in the ratings, but things like Mercedes, active examples of actively creating value. Does this actually improve society. Now, this is necessarily qualitative, but most important decisions should be qualitative. Think of a tenure decision. Do you just count papers and count Google Scholar citations? No, you probably interview people. You probably read the papers. Who do you hire? Do you just look at their CV? No, you interview them. And similarly here, what we're going to try and do is to make a qualitative assessment. And that's something which might not be priced in, so it might actually generate alpha. What are the things that might go into the qualitative assessment? One is excellence. One of the best things that you can do as a company is just to be excellent at your core business. Well, if you are a train company, make the trains run on time. Well, that has a huge effect on people's lives, much more than what you're giving to charity. As a professor, one of the best ways we contribute, not the fact that I bike to my lectures rather than driving, it's the fact that I'll try to prepare for every single class and make sure that it's practical and not just theoretical. This might seem obvious, but many people just forget about the core business as being one of the ways you serve society. Number two is the idea of comparative advantage, which I mentioned before, right? As a company that's doing ESG, go back to Friedman. Your role is not to try to contribute to all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals, to be all things to all people, but to focus on the issues where you have expertise in solving. This is why Mercedes focused on reverse engineering rather than just giving to a charity. And finally, to think about materiality. Right, there's tons of stakeholders there, customers, employees, the environment, and so on. But who are the most material stakeholders? Some of you will know the paper by Khan, Seraphim, and Yun, which shows that only serving material stakeholders leads to long-term stock returns. So what I think I'd like from future research on ESG is much more nuanced. Not is ESG good or ESG bad? That's a bit like asking, is food good or bad? Right, some food is good for you and some is bad for you. I think the really exciting papers that we might see going forward is not just looking at aggregate ESG ratings, but trying to look at, are you doing ESG in areas in which you have comparative advantage? Are you trying to actively do good, not just to do no wrong? And as Swani kindly mentioned, I wrote this book last year, Grow the Pie. Why I wanted to write this was two reasons. First, I was teaching a responsible business class myself, and a lot of the texts that I saw about this were not really academic. They were written by people sort of punting. They might be ex-executives without much research behind it. So what I wanted to do was to bring this research to life, to draw not just my own research, but research by a lot of scholars on this, and to make this accessible to a general audience. I've got a set of teaching materials. I know that many people at other schools are already teaching it. And if you are interested in teaching it in a class, then hopefully these teaching materials will be of value to you. But thank you so much. It's been a huge honor to have this opportunity. Again, sorry that UK restrictions and so forth don't prevent me from being here, but I'd love to have a Q&A now. And so should I hand back to Swanedeep to do this?
Thanks very much, Alex. Thanks for that wonderful lecture. Could we now have a few questions from the floor? We have someone walking with a microphone. If you would want to raise your hand, she will reach you. There at the back.
Great insights, great presentations. I'm trying to link to the keynote speech from yesterday. So Jaap Winter was talking about feelings. So I'm thinking, yeah, I think like cognitively and rationally speaking, we all have our specialization. As the case you were putting out that professors should do should focus on teaching and research, and other professions should be doing the same things. But I think how do you view it if you see, for example, or if your students see that you are driving an, I don't know, old diesel car, but not cycling, and in that sense, maybe we do need to address certain parts of the feelings, saying that yeah, we are together in this, trying to solve that bigger issue. So what's your take on not really your core function, but also perhaps what the society thinks you should contribute?
I really appreciate this question. And next week, I'm giving the keynote speech at the FMA. Normally, when you're given this chance to give a keynote at the FMA or wherever, you present your own research, right? That's a way of giving it a higher stage and getting more citations. Instead, I'm going to give a talk called The Purpose of a Finance Professor, which is what I think the purpose of our profession is. Now, I know that's a bit of a lofty title for our speech, but I think it's something that sort of really captures our feelings and is why we choose this job to begin with. We could make far more money if we went into industry. And one of the things I do think is the impact on our students, right? This is something which really does not get rewarded, but I think intrinsically makes a huge difference. And what is interesting is there's a lot of professors who have not really done ESG in the past, who suddenly just jumped on the bandwagon and start sort of proclaiming themselves to being gurus of purpose. And yet they are completely disdainful and disrespectful to their own students, when I think this is a bit of greenwashing, right? If you are truly a finance professor, don't just try and swan around the World Economic Forum in Davos and speak to other CEOs. Teaching students is one of our core things. Now, there was a time I was at Wharton, I think I had my 5th year review. At the time, I had 12 A publications, and yet I was told the chance of you getting tenure is virtually 0. So some of you might know the story. I had a sort of difficult time getting tenure because of some people who had some certain views about research there. And then one of my students came into my office shortly after this, and I was just in a really upset mood. And he said, oh, look at all these teaching awards on your wall. And I said, none of this matters. I'm going to be fired. I'm not getting tenure here. And he said, no, each of these awards represents 200 students whose lives that you might have touched through this. And that is something where I truly believe this is what we are doing as academics. And that's something which nobody can take away from you, right? If you submit a paper to a journal, you could have worked so hard on that, but whether you get it accepted just depends on the whims of the referee, which referee happened to be selected. Obviously, as editors, we're trying to make this less random, but there's still going to be some noise. Whereas something like teaching, making this effect on your students by really caring about your research, maybe being a role model to them by not driving the old car and so on, I think those are things which are really intrinsically satisfying. So in a profession, which I think there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of rejection, how can we find purpose in it? It is those other things, thinking about the purpose of what we're doing and linking it to emotion. So I really appreciate that question.
Okay, next question. Yeah, Cynthia?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to, Cynthia Williams, I'm a law professor, so I'm not a finance professor, but I wanted to ask you about your debate or your views of Lucian Bebchuk's work on the Business Roundtable. Because as you well know, he has been very prolific in writing that the Business Roundtable statement is nothing but hypocrisy. So I guess to generalize, how important do you think it is that business elites say things like, we believe we have obligations to society? Thank you.
Thanks so much for the question. I really respect Lucian's work, and although we might have slightly different views, I think his views are based on a lot of logic in his own research. And like the events that I do with him are sort of styled as a debate to make them more exciting, but actually there's more commonality than differences. I actually think there's quite a lot to what Lucian is saying. So his concern is the Business Roundtable statement is something which is vacuous. They didn't actually put it into practice. Now, one might argue it's useful for leaders to come out and make a statement just because they're respected. Just like if a leader was to say, well, I support equality, I think what's happened with George Floyd is terrible, even though that's nothing to do with them directly, it was a police issue, to make a statement like that means it makes a big difference. But I think those statements only really make a difference if you follow through with them. I think if you don't, it's actually more damaging than making the statement to begin with. Because the next time a CEO makes a statement, let's say, oh, we're in financial difficulties, but don't worry, we're not going to fire anybody. They're not going to be believed. And so I agree with Lucian that a statement alone without any action is something which can be more damaging than it might otherwise be. And then people think, well, then why did they make the statement? Well, people think they might have made the statement to dissuade regulators from regulating by saying, oh, we're going to care about wider society. And that leads to people like Tarek Fancy arguing that sustainability is a ruse because it's a way of preempting regulation.
There's a question from Ruth.
Hi, thank you for your great presentation. This is Ruth Aguilera. Just very short question. What is your view on the standardization of the ESG index, measurement?
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. And many people think standardization is great because one of the challenges with the ESG is how do you actually measure who's putting it into practice? Just linked to that last question, you want to evaluate, are people putting their money where their mouth is? And the whole idea of standardization and comparability, that sounds great, but I think it's a red herring because there's always going to be differences of opinion, right? So if we had one standard evaluation of how responsible a company is, that's tricky because there's going to be different views, right? So if a company shuts down a polluting plant, that's good for the environment, but it's bad for workers. And so different people are going to have different weights on that. Similarly, some people might have a Catholic values idea, and other people might not have those values. So I think it's going to be very difficult to have something which is standardized because there's different viewpoints. People look at the inconsistency of ESG ratings and say, oh, this is really bad. We'd love one standard rating. But another word for inconsistency is diversity, right? There's different opinions, right? When I get two referee reports, one might say reject, the other might say R&O, and that's really useful to me. That's better than two things which are highly correlated. When you are looking at equity research reports, somebody says buy, somebody says sell. That's not to say that these reports are useless. In fact, it's actually more interesting to look at that. So what I think is that you can have standardization on underlying inputs. Right? There should be one clear way of measuring carbon emissions, be it scope 1 or scope 2, one clear way of measuring something like employee turnover, whether you're considering part-time or full-time. However, the assessments that you make, which are based on those underlying inputs, will automatically differ. And so the whole idea that there should be one sort of aggregate score, one clear rating, I don't think is possible. And I think this makes things like B Lab and B Corp a bit challenging. So I do understand the benefits of B Corp, and I am an investor in many angel companies that are B Corp. But the issue is that why is B Lab, which provides the B Corp certification, the one entity which is allowed to say who is ethical and who's not ethical? Other people might have other beliefs. There are some people saying that you're not a truly ethical company unless you've got B Corp certification. But I would disagree with that because I would say that there's many ways in which to measure ethicality. That's one framework. And certainly there's ethical companies who have that certification, but I wouldn't say that not having it shows that you're not ethical.
Okay. In the interest of time, Alex, thank you very much. We would probably close the questions at this point. Thank you very much for being with us, Alex, and I hope we will meet in person sometime soon in Groningen.
Thank you so much, Wandeep. It's a huge honor to have been invited to play such an important role at this conference on a topic I really care about. And again, hopefully in the future, the world will open up. It's really nice to do these things and to mingle with people afterwards, but thank you at least for your interest in hearing from me virtually today.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you.
Okay. Go for lunch to the award ceremony, which I will do over there. And so please, if the technicians can put up the slides. Yeah. Yep. Okay. So the tradition of having the best paper award ceremony during the annual ICGS conference is continued also during this year's conference. But this year's conference, the setting is a bit different because it's hybrid. So that means that some of the nominees are here, but some of the nominees are also out there online. So in a few minutes, I'm going to announce the winners of the Best Paper Award and the winners of the runner-up Best Paper Award. And the winners of the Best Paper Award will receive a certificate and a money prize of £750. And the winners of the runner-up Best Paper Award will receive also a certificate, not the same, but also a certificate, and also not the same prize, but still a prize of £250. And the prizes of these two awards are sponsored by Wiley Publishers, and we very much thank them for their generous support for these awards. Now, I will tell you something about the procedure, and the first slide already tells you a bit about this. We had 169 submitted papers, and of those submitted papers, we accepted 137. And these papers were, well, you were in the procedure yourself, they were linked to a theme, a track theme, 6 of them. And we had track chairs who then distributed these papers to reviewers, at least 2 of them, who were asked to write a short report, a short review about these papers. And based upon these reviews, the track chairs then nominated or able to nominate papers for the Best Paper Award. And we, in the end, we received 8 nominees for the Best Paper Award. And I'll just show you the 8 papers. They're quite long in terms of title and number of authors in some cases, but I still will mention them because it's a great honor that they are not among the nominees. So the first one was Differential Effects of CEO Hubris and Overconfidence on Firm Performance, a meta-analysis by Temitope Oladimeji, sorry for making it a difficult pronunciation, and David Harrison. Second paper nominated was Different Shades, the Effects of Hedge Fund Activism and Corporate Shareholder Activism on Competitive Actions by Mark Desjardins, Wai-Shi and Zihui Su. Third nominee was Who Cares About Director Fit in the Board, Director Distance from Their Peers as Antecedent to Director Election Outcomes and Turnover by Sander de Grote, Matthijs van Petegem and Dieter Smulders. Fourth nominee is Critical Mass of Women on Corporate Boards. Is 3 Still the Magic Number by Ruth Seeley, Joanne Grossvold and Louise Tilbury. First 4, then next. Sorry. Yes, this one. So next 4, The Cost of Conformity to Good Corporate Governance, Board Design Configurations and Compensation by Julia Ponomareva, Ryan Federo, Ruth Aguilera and Sven Olof Collin. 6 nominees, CEO Pet Projects, Paul Dick Hare and Dennis Susiora. 7th nominee, The Advisory and Monitoring Roles of the Board, Evidence from Disruptive Events, Ettore Croci, Gerhard Hertig, Laila Koya and Lululan. And the final one, Seen and Not Heard, Gender and Board Dynamics Beyond Critical Mass, Louise Tilbury, Ruth Seeley and Emma Jeans. So these are the 8 nominated papers, and you already got a quick view of the next slide, because those 8 papers were then read carefully by 8 members of the Best Paper Award Committee. We asked to read those papers. So these are the names of the 8 members of this committee. I believe they are all in Groningen, so not online. The list is visible here. So Ruth Aguilera, Bill Judge, Alexandra Gregoric, Georg Wernicke, Margarethe Wiersema, Mirjam Flickinger, Patrick Verwijmeren, Ruth Aguilera, and Tron Randall. So they were the committee, they read the papers, and based upon the ratings these committee members gave to the papers, we came to decide on who wrote the best paper and who wrote the second best paper. So this is all about the procedure. Now we're going to the big final. Who wins these two prizes? I'll start with the nominee. I'll start with the runner-up. And I'll say a few words that the members of this committee said about the paper. Yeah? Okay. So the runner-up paper, some statements that were made by the members of the committee. The topic is current and highly relevant, and the manuscript provides many implications for research and practice alike. The paper is very well written. The manuscript smoothly guides the reader through the different arguments and empirical analyses, and the paper improves our understanding of the topics studied. Some of the statements made by the members. Okay. So the winner of the runner-up best paper award is Dumpty Dumpty Dumpty. Different shades of the effects of hedge fund activism and corporate shareholder activism. So the winners are Marc Desjardins, Wei Shi, and Zui Hui Su. Unfortunately, they're not here, so I cannot give them the prize in person, but we will make sure that the award will get to them by, let's say, regular mail, and the money will get back to them by online banking, right? So we have the combination. Okay, I go to the Best Paper Award, the Best Paper Award this year's conference. Again, I will make some statements, or I will repeat some statements made by the committee. Interesting topic, novel and clever approach, well explained. The combination of these things make this a very good paper. Another comment, it takes a novel data and framed within agency theory. It's an excellent paper, both in terms of rigor and relevance. The authors tackle an interesting question that has thus far been difficult to analyze due to a lack of suitable data. And a final comment made was the authors make a significant theoretical contribution to existing literature. Okay, nice words. So I think the Best Paper Award is really in good hands, I would say. Next question is, who won the Best Paper Award of this year? And the winner is CEO Pet Projects by Paul de Kerr and Demis Soshura. Once again, I have to disappoint you. I cannot ask the authors to come to the fore and receive the prize in person. But once again, we're going to make sure that they get the prize at their doorstep. So, this concludes the ceremony. Next thing is that we're going for a lunch, and I have to say that the lunch is a bit shorter because of the fact that we also have an annual meeting of the members of ICGS. So please go down, take your lunch, and be back here at 2:15 because then we will have the annual meeting. Thank you much for your attention.